Prediction time here at the Voice of College Football. We are just days away from the 2024 season. So Jason and I are ready and prepared to put our necks on the line for all of you. So we will cut it loose. And of course, you can leave your comments and questions and, yes, criticisms of our selections for 2024 in the SEC and beyond. Jason Ray's here with us, of course. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing great, Mark. Glad to be here as always. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And here we go, folks. Comments, questions are welcome. And again, we're going to go through with our predictions for the 2024 season. We appreciate your patience. Blame it on me. I had an appointment and not an online appointment. So I was out of the house and things got a bit delayed. But we do appreciate you stopping by. And here we go. So we're just one day away from Florida State and Georgia Tech. SMU is the only other power team that's playing on this Saturday. They've got a game against Nevada. So I'll tee you up, Jason. How do you want to take this on in the SEC?
I guess we can just go just one by one, starting with 16 and go all the way through one and just compare our predictions with each other. And then if there's any questions, or comments, we can address those. But obviously, we can go in a little bit more detail with Oklahoma. I don't have record predictions. I just kind of have order of finish, but I do have a record prediction for Oklahoma, and we can go into a little bit more detail on that.
All righty. I'll let you get started.
Well, and I know there's not always going to be a lot of suspense. I mean, with number 16 specifically in the SEC, but so I've got Vanderbilt at number 16. You know, Vanderbilt was the team last year that got off to a 2-0 start, beat Hawaii in a close game, I think by 7, then beat Alabama State, and then went on to lose their next 10. And so I think, obviously at Alabama, at Vanderbilt, there's not, a ton of expectations, but in 23, they went 5-7. So last year, obviously, I think was certainly a down year, even for Vanderbilt's, from their side of things. And I think the biggest deal for me, Mark, was they weren't super competitive in the SEC. Did not win the game, lost each game. Minimum amount of point differential in a game was 16. I believe that was against Auburn. They actually played Georgia to 17-point game, which is, obviously a little bit interesting at their place. So I think they'll be a little bit better at the quarterback position. Diego Bavier comes over for New Mexico State. Had a pretty good career, over 4,400 yards over the last couple of years, 39 touchdowns. So I think they will definitely be a little bit more improved. Overall, I mean, probably a little bit more down at the wide receiver position because they lose a majority of who they had last year. But when you look at offensive line, and defensively, they return 8 starters. So, but at the same time, Mark, with this schedule, they do have one of the toughest schedules in the SEC specifically, which does them no favors, right? So, they, from an average perspective, an average loss of 22.8 points per game last year. So how do they turn that into a better season? So they do have a couple of in normal circumstances, Mark, not necessarily a gimme, but games that they should absolutely win. They host Alcorn State, they host Ball State, right? Those are two that you think that you would be able to win if you're Vanderbilt. They do go to Georgia State. That's a possibility. I think the only other one probably in league play is they do host South Carolina. That's probably the only one that I would consider, a possibility of a win. Interesting game to start the season against Virginia Tech at home on the 31st. But yeah, I mean, clearly to me, number 16 here, a team that probably could get to 4 or 5 wins, but I don't really see anything outside of a major upset, them getting past 4 wins.
I've taken way too many opportunities to pick on Clark Lee because he made a statement at SEC Media Days last year, and this is coming off the previous season. There was a little hope in November because they beat Florida and Kentucky in November, and they weren't awful football teams. And so they won those two games. And he made the statement at SEC Media Days that I still don't understand what he was getting at, but he said, we want to be the greatest football program in the country. Now, of course, it's ridiculous to think that they're going to be the greatest football program in the country. I didn't know if he thought that if they go 7-5, that with the academics and you combine all that, then they're the greatest football program in the country. But I've not let him live that one down. And they were just atrocious last year, as you mentioned. I read in Athlons in previewing all the teams over the summer, and I just can't believe that this would actually be something that they would take on, but that they were going to take their two best offensive linemen and move them from side to side on the offensive line, depending on the play. Like their two best offensive linemen, if they were running right, boom, there they are. They're at guard and tackle. They're going to lead the play. Then they might play over here the next play. That's what it at least said in Athlons.
Yeah, that's crazy. I've never heard that before at any level of football.
There we have it. So that is the Vandy setup, and Diego Pavia, as Jason mentions, is the guy to remember in regards to at least the quarterback position, coming in as a transfer, 38 touchdowns, 15 picks in his career. All right. We have spent more time on Vanderbilt football than in the history of probably all the channels put together. We'll move on to 15. And so this is where it starts to get a little interesting.
It does, Mark. I think you could probably make. I'm looking here. You could probably make a case that 12 through 15, in my mind, are pretty interchangeable. But 15, I go with Mississippi State, really, just from the perspective of, they only returned 10 starters over from last year's team. Obviously, there's a lot of changes with Jeff Lebby coming over, being being a first-time head coach there. They struggled offensively, only averaged a little bit less than 22 points a game last year. Obviously, you figure that will be improved with Jeff Lebby at the helm. He's always had great offenses wherever he's went, right? So, I think Blake Shapen comes over, transfer from Baylor. Figure I haven't seen if they've announced yet. I just assume he'll be the starting quarterback, for them. Outside of that, they've got a lot of transfers in the wide receiver core. Like between the wide receiver and tight end area, I think they have 6 transfers. Kevin Coleman from Louisville. I'm not even attempt to pronounce the last name. Guy from UTEP, first team all Conference USA last year from UTEP. Trio of tight ends come over. So a lot of turnover there. All 5 starters on the offensive line lost from a year ago. Only 1 starter from the defensive line comes over a year ago. So probably a little bit better, a little bit more experience on the back end, but up front and then at the linebacker position, they're a little bit youthful there. They do have 7 true home games, so I guess there's a possibility they could get to bowl eligibility this year. Although I know Georgia, Murder's Row. As we'll see, this is going to be a theme, obviously, as you get through the SEC. But they go to Georgia, to Tennessee, to Ole Miss. They also have Arizona State in the non-conference on the road. So this is a team. I think they'll put up some points, but just the youth that they have and all of the newness around Lebby coming over and just the inexperience that they have on both sides of the ball, to me, leads them here at number 15.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a soft spot in my heart for Ole Miss and Mississippi State. I covered these two schools for 7 years in the SEC in the late 90s, early 2000s, and Alabama as well, but who can have a soft spot in their heart for Alabama? So the other two, yes, I feel sorry for them, and I kind of root for them in a minor sort of way. And with Mississippi State in particular, when they get a hold of a good coach, Dan Mullen, way back in the day, Jackie Sherrill in the 90s, Dan Mullen more recently, and now Mike Leach, you see that their maxed out position is pretty much 8-4, 9-3, finish 500 or a little better in the SEC, playing a nice bowl game, and that's who they're going to be. Now, as soon as I say that, I know because I've done it before, people are going to mention, well, in 2014, they rose to number one in the country. Well, they had Dak Prescott at quarterback. You tell me when they've had a Dak Prescott at quarterback, and of course, they still lost 3 games. So they were not a true number one team in the country. But they've had a nice recent history with the right coach. And unfortunately, of course, rest in peace, Mike Leach. His last team was 9-4. They won a bowl game against a good Illinois team. Like, they can have a nice program, and that just seemed to have derailed them. And of course, they didn't have a good season last year. And now they're starting over with Jeff Lebby, which I don't know how that's going to turn out. It would be my guess that he'll succeed based on Mississippi State standards. I think that they've made a nice hire there, but he's a first-time head coach. And of course, they're addressing the offensive side of the ball. So, yeah, 5-7 last year. I would expect them to be somewhere in the same range. And after we go through your picks, I'll pull up my predictions as well, and we can compare from there.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, the non-conference doesn't really give them any favors either. I mean, Eastern Kentucky, obviously, that's a game they should win. At Arizona State's going to be tough, although, I mean, they're going to be Arizona State going from the Pac-12 to the Big 12 is going to be a little bit of could be problematic. Toledo's probably the best team in the MAC, right? So that's not a pushover. So yeah, I think it's going to be. I'm with you. They can probably get to 4 or 5. Obviously UMass should be a win, but I think they can get to 4 or 5. But it'd be tough to see them get to bowl eligibility.
Yeah, for a football team to be in the SEC and get beaten down every week, I don't know how much it really energizes the fan base to look at a schedule and say, yeah, we'll get to 4 wins probably with no problem because we got UMass and Eastern Kentucky, and we'll win those games for sure. They can't help but win those games. But the key games for them is, can they salvage something out of their season by, let's say, beating Arkansas at home? You mentioned, I think, I guess the Florida game. I guess they might have a shot at that at home. I'm not finding too many wins other than that.
Yeah.
It's going to be a tough road. If they win 2 in the SEC, if they could somehow beat Arizona State, which they're pretty much on their level, but it's a road game, then they get to 6-6 and call it a success, getting to a bowl game.
Yep, absolutely. All right. All right. So number 14, I have Arkansas. I think for me, going into out of last season and coming into this season, Mark, a little bit surprised that Arkansas elected to keep Sam Pittman. So you hate to have a guy be a sort of kind of a dead man walking coach to begin the year, but so it'll be interesting to see. It's the old, when you look at what they have returning, Mark, it's the old adage. They have 17 returning starters, which is the good news, but they were 4-8. So the bad news is they have 17 returning starters, right? So they lose KJ Jefferson. He goes over to UCF. So they bring over Taylon Green from Boise, which is a good, a good solid player. Probably maybe not quite the runner that KJ Jefferson was, but maybe a little bit better of a thrower than him. They do bring Jaquindon Jackson, 1,300-yard rusher over the last 2 seasons, from in the running back room. I think they're a team, Mark, as well, that they were victimized by a lot of close losses, similar to what we'd kind of talked about with Oklahoma a few years ago. They had 5 games that they lost by a total of 23 points against BYU, LSU, Ole Miss, Alabama, and Mississippi State, right? So so that was the good thing, but they did lose to Missouri and Auburn by a total of 72 points late in the year when it kind of looked like the kids, I don't know if they quit on them, but just really maybe lost interest late in the year. So as you have here, a tough matchup week 2 against Oklahoma State. They've got um, the first part of the schedule is outside of Arkansas Pine Bluff, and should be able to beat UAB. You go to Jordan Hare on the 21st. You've got A&M in Arlington right there on the 28th. Tennessee um, comes calling, but you have to think, Mark, when you look at this, probably Arkansas is a favorite in 3 to 4 games, right? Arkansas Pine Bluff, UAB, and I think they have another non-conference late in the year that they might be um, a favorite in. Yeah, Louisiana Tech. But so I got Arkansas and Mississippi State like very, very close to one another. I gave um, Arkansas just a little bit of a benefit of the doubt, just because just the newness that comes from Jeff Lebby over at Mississippi State. But I don't know that it'll be enough for Pittman to survive. I think he's probably got to get them to a bowl game. You would think to get that going.
Yeah, not much seems to be pointing in the right direction for Arkansas. KJ Jefferson to Taylon Green. That is, unless Taylon Green severely improves, he was a decent quarterback at Boise State. They did win the Mountain West Conference Championship, but his accuracy needs to improve considerably. He's a runner, and yeah, they just don't have the recruiting base to keep up in the SEC. And Sam Pittman got off to an excellent start there and bought himself some time with a 9-4 season a few years ago. But that seems like it's ancient history at this point, and it is tough to try to find 6 wins to get them to a bowl game, which may be required for him to keep his job.
Yep, I'm with you.
All right, next
All right.
up.
So for number 13, I have Florida. Again, when you talk about this, probably not the same exact thing, but when we talked a little bit about expectations, right, in terms of what the expectations are at Mississippi State versus maybe what the expectations are at Florida. So I would say right now, if the seat isn't hot in Gainesville, maybe it's just a little bit warm, right? So Billy Napier is 11-14 in his first 2 years in Florida. So I think when you look at that, that's nowhere near the expectations that are expected in Gainesville. And so what does that look like? Has a pretty good quarterback coming back in Graham Mertz, 20 touchdowns, 3 interceptions a year ago before he got hurt. I believe missed the last 2 games of the regular season. They're um, They got a couple of additions at the wide receiver position. Shamiri Dyke comes over from Wisconsin. Elijah Badger from Arizona State. Both of those are 1,500, 1,600 yard receivers in their collective career. That comes over. Only returned 6 starters on defense. Of course, that's a defense that gave up about 27 points a game. So maybe not necessarily a bad thing. So I think the first 4 weeks for this team is going to be incredibly critical, right? Week 2, you got to give me against Samford, but Miami, I think there's a lot of hype coming in with Miami this year. It's they're sort of a show me type of thing, but that'll be a very probably one of the better games in week 1, Mark. Miami coming to the Swamp, but then they host Texas A&M and go to Mississippi State. If for some reason they're 2-2, 1-3 in that group, then that's not going to work out super well for them. So I don't know. I think they do have some. If Mert struggles, they do got Lagway, that the true freshman. phenom, so to speak. So, but then they host UCF, then they go to Tennessee, and obviously, I mean, you're just going to go on and on. They do have, according to Phil Steele, the toughest schedule in the country. So having that tough of a schedule does not lend to a team. So I think if they need to get to a bowl game this year. I mean, I don't know if they'll be able to get there, Mark, with that schedule being as tough as it is. But if they can, if for some reason somehow they can upset Miami early on, win a couple of these games, in the conference specifically against A&M, it might get them there, but I think they'll have to pull off an upset or two along the way.
I can't remember seeing a tougher schedule. I'm not saying that they don't exist or they haven't existed, but I don't think there's a question. This is the most difficult schedule in the country this season. And this closing stretch is just insane when you look at the final five. And you could even extend it to Tennessee and Kentucky, but Georgia, Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, Florida State. Oh my goodness.
It's crazy. It's Mark, it's hard to, I don't know. Maybe they can steal one of LSU or Ole Miss in the swamp, but outside of that, it's hard to see a win there, right? In those final, four. I mean, sorry, or those final five. So yeah, it's going to be critical that they get an upset over Miami, or you know, hold serve against who was Mississippi State early on. So
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then I don't know what that looks like from a coaching perspective, right? I mean, he's 11-14. If he throws out another losing season, what's the what's the pulse like in Gainesville? Because as we mentioned, right? I mean, I don't know if you would consider Florida blue blood, but it's like an Oklahoma, it's like an LSU, a Texas, and that nature that they're not going to deal with losing seasons for very long.
For sure. And of course, Florida didn't know at the time, but they have married the toughest schedule in the SEC, the toughest in the nation. Well, the toughest in the SEC, but they've put it together with scheduling Florida State, which they always play, but Miami and UCF. So they're playing three Power Five conference teams outside the conference. Two of them might be top 15 teams in the country.
Mhm.
And so they have just compounded the issue by scheduling like that outside the conference, which I credit. I enjoy it. I like to see all these Florida teams playing each other to see, hey, who's going to win the Sunshine State. But that's just a crazy difficult schedule. And to make it even worse, because the SEC came out with this schedule for system for 2024 and 25, Florida's playing the same schedule next year.
Mhm.
So they're playing all these same teams. They're just playing them in the different location.
Yep.
So it's going to be just as difficult. Basically, teams change, but basically just as difficult next year. Now, yeah, Billy Napier, I got to think his job is going to rest on, first and foremost, of course, the record. But then how competitive were they? Did they go 5-7 and they just got obliterated when they lost? Or did they go 5-7 and
Yeah.
they were extremely competitive? I can't imagine that they're going to make it through the entire season, not get blown out at least once. So that's understandable. But did they get blown out 5 times? Did they lose 5 4-touchdown games and weren't competitive? And then put that together with where the recruiting class stands at that point, is, I think, going to be the fate for Billy Napier.
Yep. Absolutely agree. Okay. So number 12, I have South Carolina. They, a little bit of a down year last year, right? Going 5-7. So and then so when you look at that, brought in a lot of transfers this year. Lenore Sellers is going to be their quarterback. Obviously, very inexperienced. Was a true freshman last year. Played in I think 3 games, threw all of 4 passes. last year. Big kid, I think 6'2", 6'3", like 240, 250. So, he's a guy, a true dual threat. Spencer Rattler wasn't really, Oklahoma fans know well, wasn't really a dual threat guy, more of a in the pocket downfield passer. So will be interesting to see what they have with him. They do have a little depth at the quarterback position. Robbie Ashford comes over from Auburn, Davis Bevel from Oklahoma, so they've got a little bit there. They've got some big time talent that they brought in at the running back position, Mark. So I think this is a team that should, if their offensive line holds up, should be able to run the ball really well. Raheem Sanders comes over from Arkansas. Oscar Adaway comes over from North Texas. Both of those guys combined, Mark, had run for over 4,000 yards in their career. So should have a decent amount of improvement there. So defense was up and down last year. Actually moved to a 4-2-5 later in the year and was a lot better last 2 or 3 games um, of that season. They do return 8 starters from that group and almost the entire secondary. So they should be a lot better in the back end. Just see how they hold up front. Um, when you look at their schedule, they've got a few. They've got Old Dominion and they've got Akron, but Mark, they go to Kentucky and host LSU in 2 of their first 3 games. So, you know, how they perform in those games, and then they've got Akron, and they got an off week, and then they've got Ole Miss, Alabama, and Oklahoma on the road in consecutive games. So, much the same way that we'll talk about this well, as we go on with a lot of these teams, but still a tough schedule. I think, Mark, if when you look at LSU, Ole Miss, A&M, Missouri are their home games in conference. If for somehow they could split those games, that gives them a chance to be a bowl team, maybe win seven or so games. But yeah, I mean, just like everybody, the sledding is going to be tough in the SEC from a schedule wise.
Shane Beamer stepped into a pretty difficult situation. 2-10 under 2-8 actually was the record because of the COVID year under Will Muschamp, and Shane Beamer immediately upgraded the program. And that season, they beat North Carolina in a bowl game, finished 7-6, and they played 4 quarterbacks. 4 quarterbacks played 3 games each. None of them were like he patchworked that team together, and so Shane Beamer looked like he was the answer and off to a great start, and it hasn't worked out much since. They did have a better season than the next year. Spencer Rattler's first year with them, 8-5, played Notre Dame close in a bowl game, and then last year was a disappointment. This year doesn't look like it's going to be much better. So I think Shane Beamer's safe. I don't think he's going to get fired, but I think much like some of the other guys that we're going to mention, and this is pretty similar across the country. If you turn in a bad season or two, and then you're not necessarily on the hot seat, but you're setting yourself up from being one season away from being fired. And so South Carolina, I don't know what the administration would be considering to be a reasonable season, but I got to think that the baseline bottom would be get to a bowl game.
Yep, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
All right, next up.
All right, number 11, I have Kentucky. I think very interesting looking at Kentucky. You really know, you pretty much know what you're going to get from Kentucky, right? Each year they're going to play solid defense. They should be a team that's going to run the ball. They've been pretty consistent under Mark Stoops. Now they bring in Brock Vandagriff, right, from Georgia. Got to the point where he's had enough of just sitting behind Stetson Bennett, sitting behind Carson Beck. Carson Beck comes back for another year, then he goes. Interesting fit here. He's got all the talent in the world, but but he's never done it at a from a starting perspective, right? So will be interesting to see, to see how that goes. They do lose back-to-back 1,000-yard rusher Ray Davis, but they do bring in Chip Trayanum from Ohio State. So who is buried in the depth chart in and of itself there at Ohio State. So I think he will bring in probably the unit maybe a little bit down from what they've had last year, in the last couple of years. But if Trayanum can do what somewhere similar to what Ray Davis did last year, that would be obviously a good option. So I think this might be a team, Mark, at least early on, that maybe relies on the pass a little bit more than they have in the last few years. They do have, I think, three wide receivers that they feel good about. They do bring in I do transfer Jamori Macklin from North Texas, 1,000-yard receiver, all first team all AAC a year ago. A couple of 500-yard receivers that they kind of returned from the team last year, and Dane Key, and Barian Brown. They did have an uncharacteristic slip on the defensive side last year, right, Mark? They 2022 gave up a little over 19 points per game. Last year went up to 25, almost 26 points per game. But they do have 10 starters returning on that side of the ball, so they could be much improved from that side. When you look for their 5 road games. Oh, I'm sorry, well, wrong one. So 2-week stretch right here early on, hosting South Carolina. This is sort of the inverse of what we talked about with South Carolina, right? So they do host South Carolina in week 2, host Georgia in week 3, Ohio. I mean, that 4-game stretch, Mark, is tough. Ohio is probably, I would say they Toledo, Miami of Ohio, right there, the top 3 teams in the MAC coming in. So, I mean, and Southern Miss probably isn't necessarily a pushover. So but you would obviously expect to win that game. But the next, how they, are they? Can they get to 3-2 after this first 5? If they're 3-2 through this first 5, they find a way to beat South Carolina at home. Losses to Georgia and Ole Miss. Then I think this team has an opportunity to win potentially 7 or 8. But if they go through this, and they because you've got Vanderbilt, you've got Auburn at home, you've got Murray State, you've got Louis. So these are a lot of winnable games for them if they have the opportunity. So this is a team that could potentially get to 7 or 8 wins if the production is what you might look for and you would expect at the quarterback position, and their defense improves more to where they were in 2022.
Mark Stoops elevated this program, no doubt, and now they are safely a bowl team every year, typically in that 7-5, 8-4 range. They've had a few better seasons than that. They went 10-3 a couple years ago. They went 10-3 and just outside the top 10 in 2018. So he's had a couple nice seasons, and then again, the floor is he's lifted it to 7-5 in the regular season. But he made the comments this summer during SEC Media Days, and this is coming off of him being courted by Texas A&M, and what went down exactly, we don't know. But there are certainly stories out there about Texas A&M itself wanting him, and then the Texas A&M fans not wanting him and having enough push to break down that negotiation that was close to a deal. But he's stating this summer that we are proud of what we've accomplished and that we've grown and developed the program this far, but that we're not done. It's not good enough. And so we'll see if Kentucky can continue to progress in the right direction. I do think that so Chip Trayanum, their running back, he'll be fine for most of the season, but he's got a bad hand right now. He hurt his hand in some fashion. I don't know if he broke it, but he's probably not going to be available for the first couple games. and Ray Davis moves on to Buffalo of the NFL. So they're going to have to piece together a running game to get started. And again, Brock Vandegrift, all the high school accolades you could ever want, but we'll see if he's ready to lead a SEC program.
Absolutely. Okay. So as we go through this next cluster of teams, Mark, I feel like when you go 5 through 10, you can kind of put these teams in any real order, and wouldn't be a whole lot of opposition here. But number 10, I'm going to go with Auburn. At number 10, um, Peyton Thorne returns at quarterback, and he doesn't, I don't, he's not a guy that's going to do, I mean, a ton for you, right? 16 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. It did run the ball pretty well, a little bit over 500 yards and three more touchdowns, but only threw for a little under 1,800. Jarquez Hunter comes back. Actually, I didn't realize this till I saw that. He is the leading returning rusher in the SEC. Coming back this year, just under 1,000 yards. Obviously, that's more based on the running backs that are no longer on campus, on SEC campuses across the country. But really solid running back. They do add some guys at the wide receiver position, so that they weren't super dynamic there. Robert Lewis, who had over 1,200 yards at Georgia State over the last 2 years. Keandre Lambert Smith, 38 starts over 4 years at Penn State. But I think probably the crown jewel here for them is Cam Coleman, true freshman. Has made some, just watching highlights. He's a guy that you figure, if he stays healthy, is sort of a guy that with his athletic ability and where he's going to be a good player for them. So I think this is a receiving core that's better than they were a year ago. They were very inconsistent in a lot of ways last year, Mark. Um, they lost to Ole Miss, Georgia, and Alabama by a total combined 17 points. But again, then they lost by 17, 30, and 21 to A&M, LSU, and New Mexico State. So I think the schedule is interesting. This is one of the most interesting schedules in the country that I've seen. They do not leave the state of Alabama until October, right? So they've got 5 home games to begin the year, ending with Oklahoma, and then they have a brutal, and I mean brutal 3-game stretch after Oklahoma through October. I think it's 3 consecutive road games, that they have, with trips to Georgia, Missouri, if I remember right, Georgia, Missouri, and Kentucky. In October, and then they've got a little bit of a break in that schedule towards the end of the year, of course, until they go to Alabama to finish the year. So I mean, I think this is another situation. Hugh Freeze didn't have a great year last year, but I think this is a team that certainly should be better. Absolutely should be no worse than 4-1 going into October, specifically going against Oklahoma, 4-0 before that. So this is a team that could get certainly could get back to bowl eligibility this year, I should say.
Auburn had games against Alabama and Georgia that went right down to the wire, especially the Alabama game, of course, with the 4th and 32, the 4th and goal play that Jalen Milroe picked off and was able to pull off, I should say. And Auburn inexplicably couldn't defend the corner of the end zone when there was no reason not to. But anyway, they basically, for the second consecutive time playing Alabama in Jordan-Hare Stadium, just completely blew the game, had it handed to them and blew the game. And they had a tie game with Georgia with about 4 minutes left. But unfortunately for them, they're going to play both of those games on the road this year. And history will show you that Auburn, since they've been somewhat down, plays Georgia and Alabama tough at home. They get blown out on the road. That's been situation. And to Jason's point, their passing attack last year was abysmal. But to Jason's other point, Cam Coleman is supposed to just be a man. Peyton Thorne had one really good season in the Big Ten at Michigan State. So they're trying to recapture what he can do, which he's not going to be a great quarterback, but he's mobile. And maybe Hugh Freeze, who's an offensive guy, he's paid a lot of money to figure this out. And they didn't go get a transfer quarterback. So they have hitched their wagon to Peyton Thorne. And Auburn comes to mind because I kind of stuck my neck out on Auburn, and you'll see that in a minute, because that plus or minus 3 that I try to find was difficult to do in the SEC. But there's probably, according to history, going to be 4 or 5 teams that are going to have that plus or minus 3 in the SEC. Now, to try to find those is difficult. So there's the take on Auburn. Who do we have coming up next?
So at number 9, I have Texas A&M, a team that is incredibly talented, right? And from what Jimbo Fisher has been able to bring over, obviously Mike Elko comes over from Duke, used to be the defensive coach for A&M before he went to Duke, did an incredible job, really kind of turning that, not necessarily turning it around, because that program was not in just incredibly awful shape, but did a good job with them last year. Specifically, Connor Wegman is the guy, right? When for them, only made 4 starts a year ago, but when he was in there, performed fairly well. 8 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Did complete 70% of his passes, so that's something that you like. Obviously, you coming in. Probably Le'Veon Moss and Amari Daniels, probably the bulk of the carries at the running back position. Reuben Owens got had an injury early in the fall. He's probably out for the remainder of the season. They do return a ton of starters, Mark, 9 on each side of the ball, 18 starters total. So, and I one of the things when I was looking through A&M, Mark, one of the things that you were a little bit concerned about, as a fan, when a new coach comes in, is new style, new program, wants to put his stamp on the program, which all of those are true, but I think he understands what the expectations are at A&M, what that's all about, and what he will walk into right there, which is far from, the cupboard is far from bare at A&M. Again, with him, or with this team, starts off tough. Hosting Notre Dame, which almost everybody that Notre Dame doesn't really have a tough schedule. I believe, Mark. I'm not trying to get too far into this. I think Notre Dame has 3 true road games all year, and I think this is one of the 3 to start the season. So you've got some. As you navigate through this first portion of the season, if they could beat Notre Dame in week 1, not out of the realm of possibility to see A&M with a 6-0 start, right? Obviously tough going to Florida, but still, with that being said, you've got Missouri at Kyle Field, you've got Arkansas in the neutral field in Arlington. Obviously, the schedule gets a lot tougher on the back end, but this is a team that, I would say, Mark, at worst should be 4-2. As you look at that, host LSU, go to South Carolina, have New Mexico State, which they've been pretty solid over the last couple of years, probably a little bit down this year with all the changes they had there, and then they get to host Texas to end the year. So this is a team, like I said, they've had the talent over the last few years, just haven't been able to put it all together. But I think this is a team that's a clear bowl team this year.
I rated Mike Elko as the best head coaching hire of the offseason. I think he's exceptional. what he did at Duke was pretty remarkable. If you break down the numbers, they had lost 16 of 17 ACC games. So he takes a roster that had lost one game out of 17, and they turns them into a 9-4 football team with the same players. And they came within a drive of going to the ACC championship game his first year. So I think he's really good. He has familiarity with Texas A&M, was a D coordinator there, recruited some of these players, quite a few of them actually. And so, yeah, the schedule, I may have shortchanged A&M a bit. I do think that there's, like you say, an opportunity for 6-0. Let's say they go 5-1, and then they beat Mississippi State. They're 6-1 coming down the stretch, and they're going to beat South Carolina, you would hope. That's 7 wins. And then it comes down. New Mexico State gets them to 8, and then LSU, Auburn, Texas A&M. They could win 1 or 2 of those games since they've got LSU at home. If they win 2 of those, then that gets them to 10 wins.
Yep, I'm with you. Yeah, they
So,
have a potential to get up into that upper half of the SEC.
yep. All right. Next
All right.
up.
All right, so I think this is probably the one that could potentially get a bit of scrutiny. So I've got LSU at number 8. And really the reason, Mark, I've got LSU at number 8, they lose Jaden Daniels, who was not only the Heisman Trophy winner, the leading he was also the leading rusher on the team a year ago. They lose their top 2 wide receivers, and Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas. Garrett Nussmeier, he's going to be the guy. Just from what I've seen and heard, struggling with a little bit of turnovers in camp. Did have a really good game against Wisconsin in the bowl game. Had almost 400 yards. In that game. I think the one thing that's going to be helpful for them, Mark, is they do have one of the better, if not the best, offensive lines. Not only in the SEC, but in the country. Right. So I think how they're able to bring in, or how they're able to replace those wide receivers, what the production that you get from, from Nussmeier at the quarterback position, and then defense, gave up uncharacteristically 28 points per game. There was a couple of games, Ole Miss specifically, that they were really, really bad. They did overhaul that side of the ball, brought in Missouri defensive coordinator Blake Baker, entire new staff. So I think we'll see. They do get the benefit of the doubt on the schedule perspective, Mark, that they do. They got Ole Miss, they've got Alabama, and Oklahoma all in Death Valley. So I think when you look at the three of potentially their toughest games on the schedule, you could see some benefit there. Obviously, they go to A&M and South Carolina from a road game perspective. Now, I will say this is probably the one pick that I'm, after sometimes you do these picks and then you go back and you're like, oh, is that really what I did? But I mean, I think
Yeah.
this is a team, Mark, that can go anywhere from middle of the pack to they could play for an SEC championship if things fall into place. Would not be surprised at all to see them 5-0 going into their bye week. Obviously, USC early on will probably set the tone for them. They've got Nichols. UCLA, in my opinion, is probably going to be a pretty bad football team this year. South Alabama's a little bit down from that perspective, and then kind of the schedule starts to get ramped up a little bit towards the back half. So, can they beat some of these? How do they fare against some of these teams at home? Ole Miss, as I mentioned, Ole Miss, Oklahoma, Alabama. If they go 3-0 in those, then they're probably no worse than third in the conference. But if they struggle with some of those, they happen to lose to Florida, they slip up at Arkansas, one of these things. It could be around where I have here. So I would say clearly, Mark, I would say this is for me the prediction that I don't have as much confidence in as probably the rest of them.
It's funny you say that because I've been saying the entire offseason that this is the biggest wild card in the SEC for me. Yeah, Jaden Daniels, and you outlined it. He was like Superman. He did everything. He ran for 1,000 yards as a quarterback, and not even close to 1,000. I think he had 1,200 yards as a quarterback. He scored a zillion touchdowns. He accounted for whatever it was, 45 touchdowns. Threw 40, well, maybe more than that. I think he threw 40 and only had 4 picks. He must have run for 12 or 14 touchdowns. So let's see. I got it right in front of me. He threw 40, ran for 10. So he had 50 touchdowns. And yes, he was their leading rusher. And based on what I know, and I've got some dependable LSU folks, they don't have the kind of talent and depth at running back that you would assume that they have. They don't. Jacoby Jackson is probably the most talented, high ceiling guy. Caleb Jackson. The offensive line, yes, excellent offensive line, excellent tight end, and Mason Taylor. They lose those 2 studs at wide receiver, but they should be okay there. Kyron Lacey's a good player. The defense is what is a mystery to me, as they were just atrocious on defense, and I don't think that they can help but be better, just because it's impossible to have as much talent as they have and not be, to be the 110th ranked defense or whatever it landed last year. Like, they just got torn to shreds week after week in these games. My goodness. Yeah, they gave up 31 points to Arkansas, who couldn't score against anyone. They gave up 55 to Ole Miss and 39 to Missouri and 42 to Bama, a 35 spot to Florida. And Garrett Nussmeier bailed them out against Wisconsin after they gave up a lot of points and yardage there. So Garrett Nussmeier, I think, is going to be a good quarterback, but he's not Jaden Daniels. And from what I understand, their secondary, we're talking about arguably DBU, was bad last year. And even though they plugged a lot of holes with transfers, they weren't elite transfers. They're just guys. So, yeah, I think that this team is, Brian Kelly knows what he's doing, but he hasn't gotten the personnel back to the LSU standard that we expect. And so I expect them to lose some games.
Yep. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. Yeah, like I said, the whole wild card thing is is spot on. I've seen some people in some of these early predictions have LSU in the playoffs, and some, like I said here, middle of the pack. So it'll be interesting. Okay, so number 7, I have Tennessee. So last year, Mark, offensively was really a step back for them, which is kind of surprising. 2022, they were one of the best offenses in the country. 46 points per game. Last year, they dipped to about a little bit under 32. Now they have Nico Iamaleava. I hope I pronounced that correctly. As the new quarterback for Tennessee this year, had a pretty solid bowl game. Obviously, didn't play a ton through the regular season, but did play well in the bowl game and in the win for them. Dylan Sampson, from a running back perspective, split time with Jalen Wright last year. He'll be, you figured, to be more of the lead guy. Squirrel White and Brew McCoy are probably their best receivers coming back. They do add two-lane transfer Chris Brazil, to anchor that receiving core. But I think for me, Mark, I mean, I have, I have a lot of confidence in Heupel and his ability to put together a really good offensive football team. Where I think where the biggest concern is for Tennessee is probably the back seven of the defense. Should be pretty solid in the front seven. James Pierce is probably an NFL guy right now. Had 10 sacks a year ago. But when you look at the back end, they don't return a single starter from the linebacking or the secondary. Obviously, you've got some young kids coming in, you've got freshmen, you've got some transfers. However, I think just walking in, that would be my big concern for Tennessee coming in. A little bit of a tricky game in week 2 against NC State and Charlotte. But assuming they win, they go 3-0 against Oklahoma. Coming in there, I think that's going to be a big swing game season-wise for both teams. What that looks like then. They do have Alabama at home later in the year. A couple years ago, probably one of the best games of the year when they upset Alabama at home. I think they at one point they climbed all the way to number 1 in the rankings before they played Georgia the week after. But in any event, this is a team. Again, I don't. I mean, I think they can get to 8 or 9 wins. I don't think they're a team even from a ceiling perspective. I don't know that this is a team that can compete quite yet for an SEC championship, given the youth at the quarterback position. But this is a team that should be in that 8 to 9 win range, I think, when it's all said and done this year.
Like you said, I'll take pretty much the same tier of teams: Tennessee, Texas A&M, Oklahoma, LSU. Throw a couple more in there, possibly. I would say Auburn on the low end and Ole Miss on the high end. If Ole Miss disappoints and maybe they could drop a game or two, not expected, maybe they join that middle tier and maybe Auburn joins the middle tier. But I think there's a clear separation between the horrible teams in the SEC. There's more than usual. South Carolina, Mississippi State, Arkansas, those teams, and maybe Florida's going to look it by their record. I don't think they are that team. But this middle tier intrigues me because chances are somebody's going to elevate. Somebody's going to have a bounce go their way. They're going to take advantage of a bad schedule for an SEC schedule, a bad schedule. They're going to get some late game heroics drama. And then there's going to be a team or two that's just as good as that other team, but they're going to have those things go against them: an injury or two, a missed kick, a special teams blunder late in a game. And the difference between 9-3 and 6-6 is not going to be very much between these 5 or 6 teams. So I'm right there with you.
All right. So number 6, I actually have Oklahoma at number 6. So there's a lot of these things that we've talked about, but just to kind of go in depth and just my thoughts on Oklahoma as the season progresses. So I think there's 3 big, and I don't know that I would call these concerns. I just think these are 3 big question marks on how the season could go based on these 3 things, right? All right, so number 1, what kind of production is Oklahoma get out of Jackson Arnold, right? Is he going to be a double-digit interception guy? Is he going to be a guy that's, I think if he can be anywhere in the 20 to 25 touchdown passes and anywhere from the maybe 6 to 9 interceptions, I think Oklahoma can get where a lot of people think they can get. But if he's in the double digit interception category, fumbles the ball quite a bit, then Oklahoma might not have the season that most people here hope and think they could have. Okay, number 1. Number 2, offensive line. How is it going to gel? How is this going to perform as a unit? I think they've got that they like who they have. There's been some injuries in fall camp. I don't even really know who's going to be healthy enough to play in week 1. I don't think it's a situation where this is going to be a multiple week thing, Mark. I think they're probably going to hold some people out. They may end up holding some people out from Temple, but just because Temple is such a bad football team and it shouldn't, really, I think it shouldn't really matter. But I think, offensive line is a group, maybe more so than any other group, and how they have to gel, and they need experience, especially when you've got a bunch of new parts. Um, coming in, Michael Tarkin at the left tackle position from USC, Branson Hickman coming over from SMU at the center. Waywu coming over from North Texas, just a lot of different parts that are going to have big parts within this offensive line. How do they perform together as a team, especially as it leads up to Tennessee? And then I think there's been a lot of comments around around this as I've scrolled, um, as we've talked through this defensively, right? How good is this? How good is this team? Is it going to be a good team or a good defense, or is this going to be a potentially, great to elite defense, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of thoughts, Mark, around this team that thinks this could be a top 15, top 20 defense in the country. Can it be good enough to be top 5 in the SEC? I mean, I think we'll see. I think there's a lot of people around the country that have a lot of confidence, and in terms of what Oklahoma's brought back, what they bring in, have a lot of they've increased their talent across the board, and you've got good coaching. I think bringing in Zach Alley, from everything I've heard, has been a fantastic addition. We'll see when it comes to the games, but um, and again, schedule's murder's row. We've talked about this. So how I put this, Mark, I kind of separate the schedule in three different, I think, areas. You've got 5 games on the schedule, clear games that you have to win no matter what. Temple, Houston, Tulane, Maine, and South Carolina. Those 5, you gotta win those games. Okay. Then I think you've got 2 games that I would consider season swinging games, right? And those are 2 of the ones that you've got here: Tennessee at home, at Auburn. Okay, you win those 2 games, you probably got yourself. I mean, you're 2-0 in the SEC. You go into Dallas after a bye week, and you have an opportunity, probably a top 10 team at this point, and then you have the opportunity to um, to meet your goals, right, for the season. Then you've got 4 what I would consider just toss-up games, right? Um, that I have: Texas, at Ole Miss, Alabama at home, and at LSU, right? If they can, if they can find a way to split those games, then I think you could see them getting to a 9-3, um, 9-3 area. This is, again, like a lot of other teams, right? I mean, I think you've got an area where you could see a situation if things don't go well. This could be a 6-6 team. I think I think you could also. It's tough, but you could see this team going 10-2. I've got them in the middle, Mark. I mean, I've got 8-4. So I think this is going to be a team that's improved. I think it's not. It may not necessarily seem improved on the kind of at the surface level at the back end, but with the schedule, if this team can go 8-4, I think it's a big testament to how much improved that they've gotten, from a talent perspective on both sides of the ball in your first year in the SEC. If they go 9-3, I think they're a playoff team with the schedule. Um, but I think they go 8-4 and just a little bit um, outside of that playoff.
All right. Next rung up the ladder.
All right, so we got Missouri at number 5. Mark, I think this could be the best offense in the SEC, potentially. You got Brady Cook coming back, over 3,300 yards a year ago, 29 total touchdowns. They do lose Cody Schrader, but they bring in Nate Noel from App State, fantastic running back. They bring in Marcus Carroll from Georgia State, so I think the combination of those 2 might be just as good, if not better than what they have with Cody Schrader. The entire receiving core returns. They return 3 of the 5 starters on the offensive line. So I think this is a team that's going to put up a ton of points. They're gonna sleepwalk to 4-0. None of these I can't imagine them being challenged in the first 4 weeks of the season by any of these teams, and then they go to A&M. So I think it's like I said, this is a beneficial schedule for them. I think this is a team that probably, if some things go well for them, they're able to hold serve at home, win the games that they're supposed to. I think this is a potential 9 to 10 win team, probably a team that's in the playoffs if they can play well on the defensive side of the ball. That was the question mark last year a little bit, and kind of the same thing. They've got a little bit of change on the back end. They bring in divisional coordinator Corey Batoon from South Alabama. Secondary took some major hits, but schedule-wise, I think that schedule gives them the opportunity. I think they have a chance. Obviously, I know the Oklahoma game there on the 9th have a chance to go 4-0 in the back half of the season, as well as going 4-0 in that front half and in the middle four. How do they do there? If they split those, then I think they're a playoff team.
Okay. Yeah, it's a favorable schedule, no doubt. Oklahoma would love to have it.
Absolutely. Okay, number 4, I have Alabama. So I think when you bring back, so the big thing for me, Mark, is this is not a team that is devoid of talent. Again, kind of similar to that what we talked about Texas A&M. This is a team that's not devoid of talent. This is a team, but what does this look like with Nick Saban on the sideline? I think that's the biggest, probably the biggest question mark for me. And then when I look at the skill position players, Mark, outside of Jalen Milroe, the running backs and the wide receivers, it's not anything that just blows me away. Got a couple of interesting matchups early on in the season. They go to Camp Randall, and then they host Georgia there. Right there. Like I said, the biggest. I mean, the road games are tough. They go to LSU, they go to Tennessee, and they go to Oklahoma. Again, this is a team that could easily be in the top 2, could easily win the conference. But just on the outside looking in, I don't. Just the turnover that they had. Mark, they lost, I believe it was 31 players to the transfer portal, right? So obviously talent's not an issue from what they brought in from a recruiting perspective, transfers they brought in, but losing, that amount of roster turnover is just a bit of a concern for me. So I've got them just a slight step back. Still think this is a team that could possibly make the playoffs, but just a little bit back at number 4.
Okay. Number 5 team in the country in the preseason polls, and that's the lowest they've been since Nick Saban's 2009 championship team. And it's funny because they seem to be discounted here. They're still a top 5 team in the polls, but all the national championship talk seems to be surrounding Georgia and Ohio State. And maybe if there's a 4th team, or a 3rd team, it's Oregon, and then maybe Texas and Alabama being looked over. But yeah, the Kalen DeBoer era begins. Of course, he's been successful everywhere he's been. Jalen Milroe, does he like Michael Penix? I'm not comparing them as players, but at that position, Kalen DeBoer, can he do similar things with Jalen Milroe? All right, next up.
All right, number 3, I have Texas. A large part of this is the schedule. Mark, I think this is a team that I think, taking off my crimson colored glasses here, I mean, Quinn Ewers is a guy that's a solid quarterback. I think he's getting, I think most publications have him as the best quarterback, either top 1 or top 2 quarterbacks in the SEC. I think he's a bit below my number 1 and number 2 teams in terms of the quarterback, but a solid quarterback, almost 3,500 yards a year ago, 22 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, another 5 on the ground. I'm a little bit concerned with where they're at the running back position. Losing Jonathan Brooks from last year, CJ Baxter out for the season and fall camp. They've got Jaden Blue, which he's a solid guy. Maybe struggled a little bit in pass pro last year. What they lose at the wide receiver position, Mark, Xavier Worthy, A.D. Mitchell, JT Sanders, Jordan Whittington, all of those top 4 guys are gone. I know they bring in Isaiah Bond. They brought in Silas Bolden. They've got some talent there. Defensively, how are they going to hold up in the middle? Besides that, before I go to that offensive line, give credit where credit's due. No worse than the top 2 or 3 offensive lines in the country. They return, I believe they return 4 of their 5 starters from a year ago, if not all 5 starters. So I think this will be a very, very solid offensive line, which will allow Quinn Ewers maybe to be a little bit better, have a little bit more time out there. Will allow the running game to solidify themselves. Middle of the defensive line, as I mentioned, T'Vondre Sweat, Byron Murphy gone from last year. So I think that's those are some concerns on the middle of the defensive line. Pass rush should be fine. I think when you look at the linebacking core and the back end, I think that will be solid. They're going to be really good in the back 7. I just the only concern I would have is that in the middle of that defense, again, schedule sets up really nice if they can. If they beat Michigan in the Big House, I think they, again, kind of like we talked about with Missouri, I think they sleepwalk to Red River undefeated. UTSA is a formidable opponent, but I still think they get there. But then they got I think their biggest area, Mark, is that 2-week stretch, October 12th, October 19th, where they have Oklahoma and Dallas. Then they have Georgia at home. If they split those, I think this is a very clear split those. This is a playoff team. However, if this is a team, maybe they slip up in Ann Arbor, they go 0-2 against Oklahoma and Georgia, or they split those and they lose at A&M later in the year, they could slip to a 3-loss team. But I think probably for me, I think they're going to catch Michigan in a good spot, Mark. I think just from what they've lost over last year's team, and and just kind of what they're going to be at the quarterback position, they may get them at a good time. So I think this is certainly a playoff team in my mind. If they get production out of the running back position and interior defensive line, I think this is a team that could obviously win the SEC as well.
Yeah, Texas joined the SEC at the right time, apparently. Could have been rough, could have been ugly earlier, but coming off 11-1, the Big 12 championship, and a good showing in the playoff. Didn't get blown out, showed up, got outplayed, almost pulled it out at the end, and here we go in the SEC. All right, we're down to the final 2.
All right, number 2, I've got Ole Miss. I think there's a level of there's a level of trust that maybe you don't have with the Lane Kiffin team. What's in big games? What's he gonna? He has a propensity to kind of in certain situations, Mark, like with his decision making on the offensive side of the ball, really going for it as much as he does on 4th down, like getting his team out of games, early on in some of these situations. But I think, again, very much like Missouri, I think this is going to be one of, if not the best offenses in the SEC, if not the country. Jackson Dart has improved each year that he's been in Oxford, over 3,300 yards, 23 touchdowns through the air, 8 on the ground a year ago. They do obviously, Judkins moving to Ohio State is a little bit of a challenge from a returning perspective. They do have Ulysses Bentley, who ran for over 500 yards a year ago. Rashad Amos comes over from Miami, Ohio. Henry Parrish from Miami, Florida. Martha returned 20 of their 22 starters, is always um, which is always something that's really, really good in terms of a team that was really productive. Um, over a year ago, 3 of their top 4 pass catchers returned from last year. Schedule sets up pretty well for them. They miss Alabama, they do miss Texas, and get to host Georgia. So when you look at that top 3, top 4 team, right down Mark, they avoid 2 of those 3 in my top 4, and then they have the number 1 team at home. So, and then looking at the schedule early on, probably not much of a challenge until October 5th. Kentucky could be tough, but they go to LSU, they host Oklahoma, host Georgia here. So I think you've got a couple of games here. You've got LSU, you've got Georgia, and I'm not trying, and then Florida, right? So if I would say in that whole vein, as long as they go 1-2 in those games, I think they're a playoff team, and so I'm a big fan of Ole Miss and the way and what they have. If they can be solid on the defensive side of the ball with those returning starters, I think this could be a really good season in Oxford.
And no big surprise at the top, which I can't fault you for this. They seem to be the consensus number 1 in the country.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, the solidifier is, having Carson Beck had a really good season last year's first year starter. Almost 4,000 yards through the air. I mean, I think the one concern that you might have a little bit is, um, they have to replace a bit from a skill position perspective. They lost Dejon Edwards, Kendall Milton had over 1,700 yards on the ground a year ago. They do bring in Trevor Etienne from Florida, to kind of help solidify that. Brock Bowers is gone. Obviously, Ladd McConkey, both of those guys are in the NFL this year, but you have to have a certain degree of, as well as they've recruited, you have to have a certain degree of respect for what they're going to be able to bring back. I know there's a little bit concerned about the defensive line, Mark, that they've lost a lot there as well. How are they going to, what are they going to do to replace that? But everywhere else they're loaded. Offensive line, linebacker, secondary. Obviously, Kirby Smart's one of the best coaches in the game. I think week 1 will be interesting, right? I mean, for both sides. Clemson's a team that continues to be they're kind of third tier to Miami and Florida State, right now in the ACC. But what does that look like? Obviously, this 2 weeks, the 2 out of 3 weeks there when they go to Kentucky and go to Alabama, that could be interesting. So by no means is this an easy schedule early on, but I think it gets a little bit more manageable as the season goes. But they've got some tough road game. I mean, I don't think this is a situation where they're undefeated in the SEC by any stretch, right? I don't think anyone is there. I mean, I think everybody's going to have 1 to 2 losses at least in the SEC. So to ask them to go to Alabama and to go to Texas and to go to Ole Miss unscathed, that's going to be a really difficult ask. I think if they win all 3 of those games in Tuscaloosa, in Austin, in Oxford, then you can just kind of pencil them in as the national championship, or at least playing for a national championship, right? So, but I think all signs point to them. I mean, at no worse being a team that's in the SEC championship game.
Okay, well, we've got a scoot, but I'll throw up my SEC picks here real quick. So, folks, go to the national channel, check out the live stream from last night, and you get my full national picks, every conference and the playoffs and the whole deal. So, I've got a Georgia Alabama SEC championship game. And again, I'm not going to explain anything here, but I see a log jam. I just think that this conference is more split between good and bad than ever before. And so there are going to be some horrendous records at the bottom. But there's a layer of Tennessee, Auburn, LSU, Missouri, and I understand Ole Miss. Most people have them slightly above where I've got them, but it just takes one play or one kick or something that could drag them down with a third loss. I've got Oklahoma at 8-4 overall. And there's the rest of the conference down to the bottom with Georgia winning the SEC championship game over Bama.
Very nice.
All right, folks. Appreciate you being here. The voice of college football. One more time. It was Georgia and Ole Miss getting together for the SEC championship game, according to Jason. And I've got Georgia and Bama. We've seen that once or twice. All right, folks, appreciate you being here. The voice of college football. Jason and I get together each and every week. Please subscribe and turn on that bell for the notifications. We send out the notification for the show each and every week. It's most likely going to be on Fridays, but we don't always know exactly. But Fridays at 4 Eastern, 3 Central looks like a slot that we will do most of the time. But again, please be looking out for those notifications. All right. Well, I'm going to take in some Florida State, Georgia Tech on Saturday, and looks like you will as well, Jason. So we'll make it on back next week and set everyone up for the big Friday night game against Temple, against the Mighty Owls.
All right. Sounds good, Mark.
See everybody back here next week.